Content note: this episode discusses sexual assault policy and educational civil rights. Before we begin, I should probably tell you something about myself. I have been in academia for more than 20 years. My area of expertise is in policy communication. After noticing a pattern with my students and having to begin way too many conversations with, I need to let you know I'm a mandatory reporter. My research focus shifted slightly. For the last 10 years or so, my area of research has primarily been Title IX and education policy. In fact, I wrote a dissertation on the final rule specifically. I have spent years researching how the Department of Education rewrote the federal regulations governing how schools handle sexual harassment and assault. And one thing I discovered during that research has never left me. When the proposed rule went through the public comment process, that's the period where any American can submit feedback, over 124,000 comments were received. The overwhelming majority opposed the changes. Survivors shared their stories. Universities warned the new procedures would harm students. Mental health professionals raised alarms. And the Department of Education ignored almost all of it. But here's what I noticed. The comments that were incorporated, the voices that were heard, came disproportionately from a specific network of organizations connected to the Heritage Foundation. Today, I'm going to connect those dots. I'm Sarah, and this is Ethos Trek. And this is Episode 4, Title IX and Education Under Siege. The Long Campaign, 1981 to now. Let me walk you through a 44-year timeline. 1981. The Heritage Foundation's first mandate for leadership calls for eliminating the Department of Education and reducing federal, quote, controls over American education, unquote. 1983. Reagan tries to abolish the Department of Education. Congress refuses. 1981 to 1989. Reagan cuts the federal education budget by half. His Secretary of Education tours the country attacking public schools and teachers. 2017. Betsy DeVos, a billionaire conservative education activist with no experience in public schools, becomes Secretary of Education. 2017. DeVos rescinds Obama-era Title IX guidance that had strengthened protections for survivors of campus sexual assault. 2018. DeVos proposes new Title IX regulations that narrow the definition of sexual harassment, require live hearings with cross-examination, and reduce schools' obligations to respond to reports. 2020. Despite over 124,000 public comments, the vast majority critical, DeVos issues the final rule with minimal changes. 2025. Trump signs an executive order directing the closure of the Department of Education. Same goal, same organizations, 44 years of persistence. The Title IX rewrite. Let me be specific about what the 2020 Title IX rule did. It changed the definition of sexual harassment. Under Obama-era guidance, schools were required to address conduct that was, quote, severe or pervasive, unquote, enough to interfere with a student's education. The DeVos rule changed that to, quote, severe and pervasive and objectively offensive, unquote. Do you see the shift? Adding and instead of or means the conduct has to meet all three criteria before schools are required to act. That's a dramatically higher bar. The rule required live hearings with cross-examination. In a school setting, not a courtroom, students who report sexual assault can now be questioned by the accused assailant themselves or their assailant's advisor. It also changed the burden of proof to clear and convincing from preponderance of evidence. The switch is a considerably higher standard. DeVos also changed how victims and the accused are referred. The victim is frequently referred to as, quote, the alleged complainant, unquote, and the accused must only be referred to as the respondent. In fact, the Title IX definition of someone making the complaint says, quote, the person alleged to be the victim, unquote. The same is not said for the respondent. The definition of the respondent is, quote, the person reported to be the perpetrator, unquote. The rule narrowed what schools are responsible for. Schools are only obligated to address harassment that occurs in their, quote, education program or activity, unquote, a vague phrase that has been interpreted to exclude many off-campus incidents. The rule raised the standard for school liability. Schools are only responsible when an official with, quote, authority to institute corrective measures, unquote, has, quote, actual knowledge, unquote, of harassment. If a student reports to a professor, a coach, an RA, and that person doesn't have the right authority level, the school can claim it didn't, quote, know, unquote. Survivors advocates call it a rule designed to reduce reports and let schools off the hook. And the Heritage Foundation called it a victory. The comment process. Who was heard? Here's where my research gets uncomfortable. The public comment process is supposed to be democratic. Anyone can participate. The agency is supposed to consider all substantive comments before issuing a final rule. Over 124,000 comments were submitted on the proposed Title IX rule. The vast majority were critical. Survivors submitted thousands of comments describing how the proposed changes would have deterred them from reporting. Universities submitted detailed objections. Mental health professionals warned about re-traumatization. And the final rule was almost identical to the proposed rule. But there were changes. And when you look at which comments were incorporated, which voices actually influenced the final product, a pattern emerges. Organizations aligned with Heritage's network. Organizations focused on, quote, due process for the accused, unquote. Organizations that had been building the intellectual framework for this rewrite for years. Those comments were heard. The thousands of survivors, they were acknowledged and dismissed. This is what institutional capture looks like in practice. The forms of democracy, public comment, notice, and comment rulemaking, remain intact, but the substance is hollowed out. The constitutional stakes. Title IX says, quote, no person in the United States shall, on the basis of sex, be excluded from participation in, be denied the benefits of, or be subjected to discrimination under any education program or activity receiving federal financial assistance, unquote. That's the law, passed by Congress in 1972. The regulations that implement Title IX determine what that law actually means in practice. When the Heritage Network captures the regulatory process, they can effectively rewrite the law without going through Congress. And that's exactly what happened. The 2020 Title IX rule didn't change the statute, but it changed what the statute means for every student in America. The current assault beyond Title IX? Title IX is just one front in the war on education. Project 2025 calls for eliminating the Department of Education entirely, but more immediately, it calls for gutting civil rights enforcement. The Office for Civil Rights, which investigates Title IX and other discrimination complaints, would be dramatically reduced or eliminated. Ending federal support for public schools. Project 2025 advocates redirecting federal education dollars to private schools through vouchers and tax credits. Eliminating DEI. The document treats diversity, equity, and inclusion programs as forms of discrimination, inverting the meaning of civil rights law. Attacking LGBTQ+ students. Project 2025 explicitly opposes protections for transgender students and calls for eliminating what it calls, quote, gender ideology, unquote, from schools. This isn't education policy. It's the systematic dismantling of educational civil rights. And it's still evolving. A few weeks ago, reporting revealed that Heritage is behind a push for, quote, marriage boot camp, unquote, as federal policy. Another attempt to use government to enforce a particular set of social values. This is the pattern. Use the infrastructure of government to implement the agenda of a private ideological network. Reflection questions. Think about this with me. First, if you or someone you love experienced sexual harassment or assault at school, would you feel confident reporting it under the current Title IX framework? What would you hold back? Second, when 124,000 people comment on a proposed rule and their concerns are largely ignored, what does that tell us about whose voice actually matters in our regulatory system? Third, what would it take to build the same level of coordinated, persistent advocacy for civil rights that Heritage has built for its agenda? Concrete actions you can do this week? 1. If you're a student or a parent, find out who your school's Title IX coordinator is. Know the process before you need it. 2. Read your school's Title IX policy. Note how it defines harassment, what triggers an investigation, and what the hearing process looks like. 3. Contact your representatives about the Department of Education. Be specific. Ask about civil rights enforcement funding. 4. Support survivor advocacy organizations. Know Your 9, the National Women's Law Center, and End Rape on Campus are doing critical work. 5. Document and share your own story, if you're comfortable. Only if you're comfortable. The Heritage Network has been collecting stories that support their agenda for years. Counter-narratives matter. What's coming next? Our final episode for this series brings it all together with a psychological framework that explains not just what Heritage does, but why it works. We'll examine collective narcissism, the psychological phenomenon we discussed in the last series, and how it binds these movements together. And most importantly, we'll talk about what actually works to counter it. Because understanding the problem isn't enough. We need to know how to fight back.